Hello and welcome. This fictional story is based on decades of whispered accounts from inside a major and fictional television studio. While many crews have reported seeing shadows or hearing voices, the real terror isn't the ghosts. It's the man who allegedly controls them. They call him Bro Yim, but in the shadows, he's known as the Ghost King, and what he does to protect his studio is unspeakable. We'll explain how he got that name right after this. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the lights go out. Ken tightened his grip on the aluminum boom pole, the familiar cool metal, a mundane anchor in his evening. His real name was Lee Kian-hung, but here, in the gleaming, cavernous halls of K Television Tower, he was just Ken, the junior sound technician. His purpose tonight was simple, the same as it was most nights. Capture clean audio, don't let the mic dip into the shot, and clock out so he could meet Amy for a late-night bowl of fishball noodles. It was just a job. The fact that the show was called Supernatural Hong Kong was irrelevant. It paid the rent for his tiny Sham Shui Po flat, and that was all that mattered. The environment was anything but supernatural. Studio 3. It was a testament to modern production design. A place so sterile and brightly lit, it felt more like a laboratory than a place for ghost stories. The air conditioning hummed at a constant, chilly 18 degrees Celsius, a welcome relief from the humid October air outside. Dozens of high-wattage K-lights hung from the ceiling grid, flooding the set with an intense, shadow-banishing white light. On the polished grey floor, thick bundles of black cables were taped down in neat, angular lines, connecting 3 broadcast cameras to the control room hidden behind a dark pane of glass. The set itself was laughably normal. 2 plush, beige armchairs and a low, glass coffee table that the crew had been warned, repeatedly, to use coasters on. Ken glanced at Clara, the floor manager, who was ticking items off her digital clipboard, her face illuminated by its bluish glow. Sam, on camera 1, was scrolling through his phone, his expression bored. They were all in good spirits, energized by the pre-show caffeine buzz and the shared, unspoken desire to get this recording done efficiently. This was the epitome of a normal, relatable environment for them, a workplace. The supernatural was just the product they were packaging tonight. No different from the cooking show they filmed here yesterday or the financial news segment scheduled for the morning. The guest arrived at exactly 7:45 p.m., guided by a young production assistant. He was Mr. Chin, a moderately famous local storyteller and historian. Ken had seen his books in the windows of cluttered Mongkok bookstores. He expected someone intense, perhaps dressed in traditional silks, reeking of incense. Instead, Mr. Chin was a man in his late 50s, wearing a sharp, modern blazer over a simple black t-shirt. He was relaxed, smiling, and carried an aura of cheerful professionalism. "Ken, mic him up," Clara murmured, not looking up from her tablet. Ken nodded, grabbing a fresh lapel mic from his kit. "Mr. Chin, sir, just need to get this on you." Of course," the guest said, his voice smooth and amiable. He turned to let Ken clip the small black microphone to his blazer. "My goodness, this is a state-of-the-art setup, very impressive, much brighter than the old RTHK studios I started in. Those places had a chill." He laughed, a short, hearty sound, and Ken couldn't help but smile politely. The man was charming. He seemed as unfazed by his ghoulish subject matter as a chef would be by a raw chicken. He was here to do a job, same as Ken. "We try to keep it modern," Ken replied, deftly hiding the thin wire under the jacket. "There, just talk normally. I'll be listening." "Excellent. Thank you, young man." Mr. Chin settled into one of the beige armchairs, chatting casually with the host, a young, eager woman named Jane. He complimented the studio's design again, joking with the crew and asking Sam about the lens he was using. There was no pretense, no ominous air. He was just a man at work. "All right, people, quiet on set." Clara's voice cut through the chatter. Going for a take in 10, 9, 8. The casual energy instantly snapped into focused professionalism. The idle chatter ceased. Sam peered through his viewfinder. Ken raised the boom pole, settling his headphones over his ears, and the world dissolved into the pure, isolated feed from the microphones. He heard the faint rustle of Jane's jacket, the almost inaudible hum of the lights, and Mr. Chin's gentle, preparatory clearing of his throat. And action! The on-air light glowed red. Jane smiled brightly at the camera. Welcome back to Supernatural Hong Kong. Tonight, we are incredibly honoured to have historian and storyteller Mr. James Chin with us. Mr. Chin, you've written extensively about the other side of our city. You're here to share some real experiences, not just legends, all tied to some of Hong Kong's greatest disasters. Is that correct? Ken focused on his audio mixer, adjusting the gain as Mr. Chin leaned forward. The guest's voice was perfect, rich, clear, and perfectly modulated. That's right, Jane. Thank you for having me. You see, most people think of ghosts in old, abandoned places, but the truth is, tragedy imprints itself. And this city, this vibrant, modern city, is built on so much tragedy. Ken stifled a yawn. He'd heard intros like this a dozen times. His mind drifted to Amy. Had she eaten yet? He hoped she'd remember to pick up milk on her way home. His eyes scanned the studio. It was bright, comfortable. Sam executed a slow, smooth zoom. Clara watched her monitor. Everything was normal. Take the 1972 Sao Mau Ping landslide, Mr. Chin was saying. His voice was no longer just amiable. It had taken on a storyteller's cadence. Drawing the listener in, Ken, listening for plosives and sibilants, heard the words with technical clarity. Over 70 people buried in an instant, a whole community, gone, now, years later. They built a park there, beautiful, modern, just like this studio, but the residents in the high-rises that overlook it, they tell stories. Ken's fingers rested lightly on the faders. His job was to make sure this story was captured perfectly. A friend of mine, a taxi driver. Mr. Chin continued. He told me he picked up a woman there late one night. She was soaking wet, even though it wasn't raining. She asked to go to an address in Kwun Tong. He drove for 10 minutes, chatting away, and when he turned around to ask her for the specific building, she was gone. The seat was dry, but the floor mat, it was covered in wet, muddy soil that hadn't been seen in that area since 1972. The studio was silent, save for Mr. Chin's voice. Ken looked at Jane, who was performing the perfect expression of fascinated concern. He glanced at Sam, who was holding his shot, steady as a rock. This was just content. It was a well-told anecdote, designed to entertain, to give a little thrill. It was a product, and they were all on the assembly line. The air remained a steady, machine-cooled 18 degrees. The lights remained blindingly white, killing every shadow. The modern, clean, relatable environment felt as safe and secure as a bank vault. No one felt the slightest, faintest chill in the air. Not yet. The first episode went perfectly. Supernatural Hong Kong, Part 2 had launched without a hitch. The set, a tasteful blend of modern minimalism and antique dread, looked fantastic under the professional lighting. The host, Jane, was charismatic, and her first guest, a skeptical folklorist, had provided the perfect counterbalance. Jane and her small, dedicated crew, Ken at the soundboard and Sam managing the cameras, had celebrated with cheap beer and a shared sense of accomplishment. They were creating something special, something that tapped into the primal fear of the unknown while keeping its feet firmly in the realm of high-quality production. The success of the first recording created a dangerous comfort, a layer of professional insulation that would soon prove useless. Preparation for the second episode began 2 days later, and the first hairline crack appeared. Jane was in the small, cheaply furnished green room, going over her notes. He looked up when the single overhead bulb gave a sharp, buzzing flicker, casting the room in a strobe of yellow light before settling. It was a small, mundane annoyance, a simple detail of a building that was, like most things in the city, slightly old and poorly maintained. Jane barely registered it. He sighed, rubbing his temples, and shouted out the door, "Sam, get building maintenance to check this light, will you? It's giving me a headache." He rationalized it instantly as faulty wiring, a dying bulb, a power surge from the storm that had passed through last night. It was an inconvenience, not an omen, but for anyone watching, for anyone attuned to the story being told, this was the first tremor. This was the opening chord. The audience, unseen and unheard, senses that the bulb wasn't just failing, it was reacting. It was the first sign that the atmosphere was becoming charged, that the simple act of preparing to talk about these things was thinning the veil. It's always old wiring or bad plumbing. These are the comfortable lies we tell ourselves, the mundane explanations we cling to when the edges of our reality begin to fray. It's the excuse you use right before the darkness settles in for good. The guest for the second episode, a man named Mr. Han, arrived. He was different from the polished academic of the first show. He was a small, nervous man in an ill-fitting suit, his eyes constantly darting to the shadowed corners of the studio. In his left hand, he tightly clutched a small, tarnished silver amulet on a leather cord. He never once let it go. Jane, ever the gracious host, shook her hand, noting the clammy, cold skin. He saw the amulet and filed it away as a prop. Or perhaps just a quirk. It's normal to be camera shy. "Mr. Han," Jane said with a reassuring smile. "We'll just have a conversation. Forget the cameras are even here." Jane's producer mind catalogued the man's anxiety as good television, authenticity, raw emotion. He dismissed the man's genuine, palpable terror as simple stage fright. The audience sees something else. They see the amulet not as a quirk, but as a shield. They recognize the desperate grip of a man who has brought a small, flickering candle into an abyss. They understand that he isn't afraid of the cameras. He's afraid of recalling the story he's about to tell. He's afraid of what might be listening. A rabbit's foot clutched against a tidal wave. It's a gesture of faith, admirable in its own way, but ultimately profoundly useless. They got him mic'd up and seated. "Cameras rolling," Sam called out. "And action." Jane began her introduction, her voice smooth and professional, as he set the stage for Mr. Zahan's story. A sharp crackle of static, like a foot stepping on the dry leaves, burst through the studio monitors and Jane's earpiece. It lasted only a second. "Whoa!" Jane flinched, pulling the earpiece out. "Ken, what was that?" Ken, ever the technician, was already scanning his boards. "Sorry, Jane, must be some signal interference from a nearby radio tower. I'll filter the frequency. We're clear now. Go again from the top." Jane nodded, composing herself. It was a technical glitch. These things happened. They were a small production, and sometimes signals crossed. He put the interruption out of his mind, blaming technology, the weather, the dense broadcast signals of the city. The audience, however, felt the chill. They knew it wasn't a radio tower. The static hadn't been random noise. It had a texture, a malevolence. It was an interruption, a digital shh from an uninvited listener. It was the sound of something clearing its throat, demanding attention. It was a warning shot, fired directly at the crew's fragile sense of control. They restarted. Mr. Han, now visibly trembling, began to speak. He was a survivor of a horrific, multi-car pileup on a remote mountain pass years ago. As he began to set the scene, the rain, the fog, the screech of metal, the air in the studio began to change. Can we turn up the heat?" Jane whispered to Sam during a brief pause, rubbing his arms. "It's suddenly freezing in here." Sam looked puzzled. The AC is on its lowest setting. Jane, it shouldn't be cold. Jane just shook his head, blaming it on his own nerves, on the drafty building. Must be me. Then, let's keep going. The audience knows this cold. It is not the sterile, mechanical chill of an air conditioner. It is a wet, invasive cold that sinks into the bone. It is the signature of a presence. The temperature doesn't drop because the heat is leaving. It drops because something else is arriving. Something that consumes warmth as it moves. The cold isn't coming from the vents. It's seeping through the walls, radiating from the very story being told. Mr. Han leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the amulet. He had reached the climax of his story. His voice dropped to a barely audible, shaking whisper. The road was still wet, and in the middle of it, I saw two white figures standing beside the wreck. The moment the words white figures left his lips, it happened. It was not a flicker. It was not a fade. It was an execution. Click. Every single light in the studio, the key lights, the fill lights, the bright overheads, even the on-air sign, died simultaneously. The erasure was total, violent, and absolute. They were plunged into a profound, suffocating darkness. A heavy, metallic clank echoed from the lighting grid high above them, as if a circuit breaker the size of a man's head had been thrown by an invisible hand. Damn it! Sam's voice swore from the control corner. A main breaker must have blown. Stay calm. Everyone, don't move. Jane felt her heart hammer against his ribs, but his producer brain was already spinning. A power outage, a technical disaster. He tried to rationalize it, to find the logical cause, the point of failure. But the audience knew. The audience understood the terrifying, perfect synchronicity. It wasn't a breaker. It wasn't an overload. The words had done it. The story had reached out and snuffed the lights. They had named the watchers. And the watchers had responded. They don't like to be named. They don't like to be described. And when you force the issue, they simply turn off the lights so you can see them better. Pitch black. The darkness was a physical weight, but they were not completely blind. In the blackness, a single, defiant red light glowed. The recording light on camera 1. It remained on. A faint, demonic eye, unwavering, and the microphones were still hot. The cameras, running on independent battery packs, still rolled, capturing nothing but an impenetrable void. Jane tried to laugh, a dry, choked sound. Well, that's timing for you, our folks. Looks like we're having a few technical difficulties. His voice was thin, a reedy tremor that fooled no one, least of all himself. He was no longer a host. He was just a man in the dark. The rationalizations were failing, crumbling like dry plaster. The audience was holding its breath. They knew the technical difficulty wasn't the problem. The dark was the problem. The dark was the guest that had just arrived. This is the pivot. The moment the campfire story becomes the campfire. The moment rational explanations die and the cold. Ancient fear of the dark takes absolute control. No one spoke. The only sound was their own breathing. Suddenly loud and sharp in the dead air. Jane's quick, shallow gasps. Sam's held breath. Mr. Han's terrified, whimpering inhales. And then, another sound. It was picked up by the hypersensitive condenser microphones, amplified, and fed directly into Jane's earpiece. A faint, wet shuffling. It wasn't Jane. It wasn't Mr. Han. It wasn't Sam. It was coming from the far corner of the studio, the empty space behind the cameras, the place where the shadows had been deepest. Sam, is that you? Jane whispered, her voice cracking. The shuffling stopped. The only sound was the red light, glowing. The audience knew. It wasn't Sam. It was in the room with them. The show wanted to talk about the dark. And now, the dark had decided to join the conversation. The silence that fell over Studio 3 was heavier and more absolute than the darkness that had preceded it. It was a vacuum, sucking the air from the room, broken only by the sharp metallic scrape of Mr. Bahan pushing his chair back. His face, illuminated by the pale green glow of the emergency exit signs, was a mask of waxy, profound terror. "I'm not telling that story anymore." His voice was thin, a dry rasp that barely carried. The director, Daniel, rubbed his temples with such force that his knuckles went white. "For God's sake, Han, it is a voltage spike. The building is old. Don't be dramatic." "That wasn't a voltage spike," Han whispered, already fumbling to unclip his microphone. "She doesn't want me to." "She? Who she?" the producer, Clara, asked, forcing a placating tone. But her smile was a tight, nervous grimace. The investors were watching the feed. This delay was costing thousands per minute. "Let's all just take 5. Sam," she snapped at the camera op. "Get catering to bring up hot coffee, now, and someone get electricians down here. Not just the house tech." The crew, grateful for the release, burst into a cacophony of nervous chatter, the tension breaking like a fever. They complained about the equipment, the building, the schedule. They reset their gear, checked their batteries, and laughed too loudly. They explained it away, a coincidence, a power surge, a faulty breaker that just happened to trip at the same precise moment in the story. 3 times in a row, no one, not a single person, looked at the empty guest chair, which sat in a pool of dim, operational light, looking expectant and cold. No one, that is, except Ken. From the quiet isolation of his audio booth, Ken watched the human chaos unfold through the thick, soundproof glass. He wasn't a floor tech. He didn't have to run around. His job was to listen, and he had. He pulled his high-fidelity headphones back over his ears, blocking out the crew's mundane frustrations. His fingers flew across the console, his eyes on the multi-track waveform. He spooled the recording back to the first take. He hit play. He heard Mr. Hahn's voice, confident and smooth. And the fisherman, he pulled the statue from the net. It was a woman, carved from dark wood, and her eyes. Then, a sharp crack on the audio feed as the main grid power cut, followed by the crew's curses. Ken frowned. He isolated the audio track, cranking the gain, listening to the background noise, the room tone, just fractions of a second before the blackout. There, it was faint, buried deep in the digital noise floor, a sound like dry leaves scraping across concrete. It was almost rhythmic. He looped it. Shh. It sounded like a word, stretched and distorted, but he couldn't make it out. He dismissed it. RF interference, a bad cable. He jumped to the recording of the second take. Mr. Hahn's voice again, slightly more strained this time. Her eyes, they seemed to follow him. He took it home, and that night, crack, the same power cut sound, identical to the first, the same burst of curses from the crew. Ken went back, isolating the room tone just before the blackout. He applied a filter, cutting the high-end hiss. The sound was there again, the shh, but it was louder now. It wasn't interference. It had shape. It had intent. He could almost hear the consonants. It sounded, terrifyingly, like a human whisper, digitally compressed and warped. S, ta, p. His blood went cold. He didn't want to. He really, truly did not want to. But his fingers, acting on their own, queued up the third take. He saw his own hand shaking on the mouse. Mr. Hahn's voice was a reedy quaver. His wife woke up, and she saw the wooden statue. It wasn't in the corner anymore. It was standing at the foot of their bed, and it was... This time, there was no crack. The power didn't just cut, it died. The audio file showed a total, terrifying silence, a flat line, as if the universe itself had been unplugged. And in that millisecond of pure digital void, Before the emergency backup mic power kicked in, the whisper came through. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a distorted artifact. It was a perfectly clear, multi-layered voice, speaking directly into the microphone. It was a woman's voice, an old woman's voice, and a young girl's voice, all at once. Mine. Ken ripped his headphones off, his chair flying back and slamming into the wall of the booth. His heart was a trapped bird against his ribs. He was breathing hard, staring at the empty, quiet studio floor. The crew was milling about, drinking coffee, oblivious. "Ken, you good?" Clara's voice crackled over his intercom. He couldn't answer. He just stared at the waveform, the visual representation of that voice. "Ken, talk to me. Are we getting audio bleed from another studio?" He swallowed, trying to find his own voice. "Clara," he croaked. "You need to come in here. You need to hear this." He heard her sigh. "We don't have time for this. Ken, if a channel is blown, just patch it. It's not a blown channel. Just, please, come here." A minute later, she swept into the booth, smelling of expensive perfume and impatience. "What? Make it quick. I have to convince Han to come back, or we're scrapping the entire segment. Listen." Ken reset the third take. He put the feed on the booth's main speakers. He played it. Mr. Han's voice. The abrupt silence. Clara frowned. "Yeah, the power cut. I was there. What's the problem?" Did you hear that?" Ken asked, his voice trembling. "Hear what?" "The pop. It's a digital artifact, Ken. When the board lost primary power, it just clipped. It happens. You, of all people, should know that. No, not the pop. The voice. It said mine." Clara stared at him. Her expression shifted from annoyed to concerned, but not in the way he wanted. It was the look one gives a hysterical child. "Ken, you're overworked. We're all on edge. There's no voice. There's just static." "It's not static," he hissed, his frustration rising. "I'll isolate it for you." He furiously worked the console, but the more he tried to clean it, to filter it, the more elusive the sound became. When he played it just for her, the whisper seemed to vanish, dissolving back into simple, explainable line noise. He played it again and again. Nothing. "See?" Clara said, patting his shoulder. "Your ears are playing tricks on you. Get a coffee. I'm going to talk to Daniel." She left. Ken was alone again, in the glass box, staring at the empty studio. He knew she was wrong. He knew what he heard. The machine had captured it, but the machine was now hiding it from her. He put his headphones back on, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip them. He looked up at the bank of monitors showing the different camera feeds. Camera 1, the wide shot. Camera 2, the host's close-up. Camera 3, focused on the guest's now empty chair. As he watched, the feed from camera 3 twitched. It was a tiny, unnatural movement, a digital jitter. He looked at the robotic controls. They were locked. No one was operating it. The camera twitched again. A small, jerky pan to the left. It stopped, then tilted down, almost imperceptibly. It was no longer centered on the chair, but on the floor beside the chair, as if it were looking at something that had been dropped. "Sam," Ken whispered into his headset, his eyes glued to the monitor. "Sam, are you on the floor?" "Nah, mate. Still by the catering table. Why?" Are you moving camera 3? A pause. "What? No. The robotics are off. We're on break." "Ken, leave it alone. It's moving," Ken said, his voice a dry whisper. The monitor flickered. The digital noise in the image, the faint grain from the low light, seemed to thicken. It swirled in the dark, empty space around the guest's chair. Then, through his headphones, live from the ambient studio mics, the whisper came again. It wasn't on a recording this time. It was now. S-ta-p. Ken flinched, looking wildly through the glass. The studio was empty. save for two stagehands moving a flat wall piece way in the back. Their voices a distant murmur. They hadn't heard it. The lights in Ken's booth flickered. Once, twice. On the third flicker, the monitor for camera 3 went black for a single frame. When the image returned, the camera was no longer pointing at the floor. It had tilted up. It was now aimed directly at the chair's empty seat. And for just a fraction of a second, before the image stabilized, Ken saw it. The seat wasn't empty. A dark mass, a void in the shape of a person, sat hunched over. It had no features, just an outline of impossible, light-devouring shadow. "Mine!" The voice slammed into his ears, not as a whisper, but as a psychic shout. So loud it felt like a physical blow. Ken cried out, tearing the headphones off and throwing them onto the console. They clattered. The live feedback screaming a high-pitched wail through the booth speakers. The door burst open. It was Clara and Daniel, their faces alarmed. "What the hell, Ken?" Daniel shouted over the feedback. "You're going to blow the speakers. What is wrong with you?" Ken was hyperventilating, pointing a shaking finger at the monitor. "The chair. In the chair. I saw." Clara and Daniel looked. The monitor for camera 3 was perfectly stable, showing a perfectly empty, well-lit chair. The studio lights were all on. The crew was starting to filter back in. Everything was normal. "That's it," Clara said, her voice hard. "You're done. Go home." "But I heard it. I saw it," Ken protested, his voice cracking. "The lights, the audio, the camera. It's all connected. It's her, the one from Mr. Hahn's story." Daniel just shook his head in disgust. "He's lost it. He's stressed, and he's hallucinating." He looked at Ken with pity. "Go home, son. We'll get the backup tech to mix the rest of the show. We'll just run the B-roll. We're cutting the ghost story." Ken looked from Daniel's dismissive face to Clara's cold, worried expression. He looked at his console, where the audio file sat, its secrets now hidden. He looked at the monitor, at the placid, empty chair. They didn't believe him. They thought he was crazy. He knew he wasn't. As they ushered him out of the booth, he took one last look at the studio. The crew was resetting for the next segment, a cheerful piece on local bakers. They were laughing. They had forgotten the cold, the darkness, and the 3 identical warnings. They had dismissed the technical failures. They had ignored the guest's terror, and now they had ignored him. The tension hadn't broken. It had just coiled, tightening its grip around the one person who was paying attention. The voltage spike wasn't a glitch. It was a defense. And now that they had decided to cut the ghost story and ignore the warning, Ken had a sinking, sickening feeling that the real show was just about to begin. The echo of Bro Yim's command, "Sit quietly and watch," faded into the oppressive, sound-dampened void of Studio 3. His voice, usually so reassuring, sounded small and thin in the vast darkness. For a single, stretched-out heartbeat, the only sound was the low, electric hum of the equipment in the control booth, a faint island of light where the terrified technicians were watching, helpless, hiding behind a stack of prop flats. Attack, the newest production assistant, held his breath, his knuckles white around the grip of a heavy-duty flashlight he hadn't even had the chance to turn on. He had been sent to find a spare battery pack, only to be trapped when the heavy, soundproof studio doors slammed shut and locked themselves. Now Bro Yim was here, the Ghost King. He was supposed to fix this. Artak squeezed his eyes shut, praying to any god that would listen. The silence broke. It was not a whisper or a footstep. It was a click, a single, sharp, metallic click, as if a VCR had just engaged. It came from the main speaker array hanging in the darkness overhead. A second click, a third, then a sound that didn't belong in a state-of-the-art digital studio. The unmistakable, high-pitched whine of an old cathode ray tube television powering on, amplified 1,000 times. Every single monitor in the studio, The new 8K displays, the old 4:3 reference monitors, the small screens on the cameras, flashed to life at once. They all displayed the same thing, a roaring sea of black and white static. The sound of that static, broadcast through every speaker, was deafening, a physical presence that vibrated Artak's teeth and shook the dust from the lighting grid. Bro Yim stood his ground in the center of the stage, his calm eyes scanning the darkness, unblinking. "I said, that is enough," he warned, his voice straining to be heard over the din. The static answered. The cacophony from the speakers began to change. The white noise twisted, modulated, and coalesced until it formed a voice, or rather, 1,000 voices layered and corrupted, fragments of old news broadcasts, forgotten Cantonese operas, the frantic cheering of a game show audience, and the weeping of a disgraced actress. "Enough?" the composite voice boomed, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We are never enough. We are the audience, and we are always watching." The full ghost manifestation began. This was not a sheet-wearing ghost or a pale-faced woman from a well. The entity was the studio itself. The static on the dozens of monitors began to move, pouring out of the glass screens like a thick, black and white liquid. The pixelated smoke flowed from the monitors, dripped to the floor, and slithered across the stage, drawn to the center as if to a magnet. The streams of energy rose up, converging directly in front of Bro Yim. It formed a towering column of pure visual noise, a 15-foot-tall vortex of writhing, glitching energy. Inside this digital tornado, pale, screaming faces flickered into existence for a fraction of a second before being swallowed again. A man in 1970s glasses reading the news. A woman in an ancient opera headdress singing a silent note. A child clutching a toy. Their faces all locked in expressions of permanent rictus terror. The temperature in the studio plummeted. A sudden, unnatural cold that fogged Artak's breath and made the metal props groan. The air grew heavy with the sharp, acrid smell of ozone and burning plastic. This was it. The true, terrifying form of the studio's haunting. The violence was immediate and shocking, with a sound like a thunderclap. The entity lashed out. A 300-pound broadcast camera, bolted to its concrete pedestal, was ripped from the floor as if it were a child's toy. The thick steel bolts sheared with a sound like gunshots. The camera flew across the studio and smashed through the triple-paned glass of the control booth, showering the horrified technicians inside with shattered glass and a spray of sparks. Alarms blared. People screamed from the other side of the glass, their cries now cut off. The entity, this towering column of spectral data, turned its non-existent gaze back to Bro Yim. The Ghost King finally moved, his calm breaking into urgent action. He reached into his jacket and pulled out, not a mirror, not a charm, but a simple, old-fashioned tuning fork. He struck it against his heel, and a pure, high-frequency ping cut through the air, a single clean note against the wall of static. "By the harmony of the universe, I command you to find peace," Bro Yim shouted, his voice ringing with authority. "This frequency binds you. Settle!" For a single, hopeful moment, the entity seemed to recoil. The static vortex wavered, and the screaming faces within it contorted in what looked like pain. The wall of sound faltered, but then the entity learned. It sampled the note. The high-pitched ping was absorbed, and then it was repeated, broadcast back from every speaker, but it came back as a deafening, distorted, subsonic bass note that shook the very foundations of the building. The tuning fork in Bro Yim's hand glowed suddenly, impossibly white-hot. He cried out in pain and dropped it, the metal clattering to the floor, now blackened and warped into a useless twist. His first tool was useless. The entity had turned his own weapon against him. He was powerless. The entity laughed, a sound of corrupted audio files, demonic feedback, and 1,000 simultaneous mocking applauses. "Peace!" it roared, the speakers cracking under the strain. "We want a performance!" It struck again. This time, it wasn't a physical object, a tendril of pure, black static. crackling with the same blue electrical energy that powered the studio, snapped forward and struck Bro Yim square in the chest. It didn't push him, it entered him. Bro Yim froze, his body locked in a horrific tableau. His eyes, fixed on the vortex, went wide with a terror Artak had never thought possible. His mouth opened in a silent scream, but no sound came out. He was completely endangered. Frost, real frost, began to form on his grey hair and eyebrows. His skin turned a pale, deathly blue, as if he were being broadcast in monochrome. The entity was draining him, feeding on his life force, his chi, like a digital vampire feeding on electricity. The Ghost King was being deleted. Artak, forgotten behind the prop flats, finally let out a choked, terrified sob. The entity heard. The massive, swirling column stopped its assault on Bro Yim, who crumpled to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. His body steaming in the supernatural cold. The vortex of static turned, gliding silently across the stage, straight toward Artak's hiding place. The young intern was paralyzed, his feet glued to the floor, his mind blank with a fear so profound it was almost a religious experience. The flashlight fell from his numb fingers. He was trapped. The entity was upon him, towering over him, the cold it emitted burning his skin. The screaming faces in the static swirled faster and faster, and a single, coherent image began to form. It was the beautiful, porcelain white face of a Cantonese opera singer, her makeup perfect, her eyes black and empty. She smiled, a grotesque, cracked lip smile, and from her smiling mouth, a torrent of black and white static poured out, reaching for him, to pull him in. He was going to die. He was going to be the new star of this haunted show. The screen cuts to black, a single, piercing audio tone. White text appears over the black, flickering as if on a bad connection. As this is the last coherent footage recovered from intern Artak's mobile phone, which was found melted to the studio floor. The final 30 seconds of the video file are corrupted beyond repair. What happened in that studio? Did the Ghost King fail? Is Artak gone? We have one more piece of this puzzle, a terrifying EVP. An audio recording captured by the control booth's black box after the feed went dead. The finale is coming. If you want to hear the voices from inside Studio 3, if you want to know the final, shocking fate of Bro Yim and Artak, you need to smash that subscribe button and click the notification bell. You cannot miss the conclusion, and let us know in the comments below. What do you think the entity is? A demon, a data wraith, or something new? The instant the harsh white work lights flooded the studio, a collective, ragged sigh filled the air. The relief was thick enough to taste, a sudden release of a tension so profound no one had realized they'd been holding their breath. The cameras whirred back to life, their indicator lights glowing a healthy, reassuring green. The rest of the crew, pale but steady, began checking their equipment, their movements jerky, desperate for the normalcy of procedure. "It's fine now. Continue the shoot," Bro Yim said, his voice abnormally flat. He wiped a sheen of sweat from his temples, his face a mask of exhaustion. Everyone nodded, eager to obey, eager to pretend the last 3 minutes of icy, whispering darkness hadn't happened. Everyone except for Ken. Ken sat frozen at his audio mixing desk, his expensive headphones still clamped over his ears. For him, it wasn't fine. The silence after the storm wasn't silence at all. While the lights were out, while Bro Yim was pleading with the shadows, Ken hadn't just heard whispers. As the sound technician, he had been the epicenter. The whispers had bypassed the air and funneled directly through his equipment, evolving from sibilant hisses into distinct, overlapping voices, screaming and pleading in a language he couldn't understand but felt in his bones. They were layered, dozens of them, a tapestry of malice and pain. Now, with the lights on and the microphones supposedly clean, the whispers were gone, but a new sound had taken their place, a single, high-frequency tone that drilled directly into his skull. It was the sound of a signal pushed past its limit, the sound of a speaker about to blow, the sound of a nerve fraying. He watched the director give Bro Yim a grateful pat on the shoulder. He watched the makeup artist nervously dab at the lead actress's face. They were all moving on. He looked down at his board. The levels were flat. 0, nothing. But the tone was getting louder. "Ken, we rolling sound?" the assistant director called out. Ken's hands flew to his headphones, ripping them from his head. The sudden clatter as they hit the desk was like a gunshot in the fragile quiet. Everyone stared. I can't," he stammered. The tone in his head remained, now joined by the muffled, dreadful hum of the cameras. The hum sounded wrong, predatory. "What do you mean, you can't? Is the gear fried?" "No, Ken looked at Bro Yim, who was watching him with a pitying, terrible understanding. The old man knew. He knew Ken had heard it all. "I'm sick," Ken lied, shoving his chair back. It scraped the floor, a sound like a scream. He flinched, his hands flying up to cover his ears. "I have to go." He didn't wait for a reply. He didn't pack his kit. He abandoned thousands of dollars of rented audio equipment, his coat, his career. He scrambled from his station, pushing past a surprised lighting grip, and fled the studio. He ran down the corridor, burst through the fire escape, and didn't stop until he was 2 blocks away, vomiting into a storm drain under the sickly orange glow of a streetlight. He was shaking so violently he could barely stand. But it wasn't from the exertion. It was from the sound, the piercing, agonizing tone that had followed him, that was still inside him. He had fled the room, but he hadn't escaped. That night was the end of Ken's life as he knew it. The scar wasn't physical. No one had touched him. It was auditory, a permanent, searing brand on his senses. The condition had a name, tinnitus, but this was no simple ringing. It was the echo of the void he'd been forced to listen to. He lost the job. Of course, he was blacklisted for abandoning the set. He tried to explain once, to a former colleague, but the words ghosts and whispers just made him sound insane. He tried to find other work. He took a job at a small recording studio, but the first time he put on a headset and heard the clean, empty room tone, the sound of pure, amplified silence, it was no longer empty. The high-pitched drill returned, and hiding beneath it, he could hear them. The whispers, the invisible shapes from the shadows. They were waiting in the static, in the space between sounds. He had a panic attack so severe they had to call an ambulance. His life became a quest for a specific kind of quiet, not total silence. That was the worst. That was when the whispers became bold. He needed a low, constant, mechanical noise to mask the ringing. The hum of a refrigerator, the whir of a fan, the rumble of distant traffic. These were his shields. He moved into a cheap basement apartment next to a laundromat, where the 24/7 drone of the dryers was a blessing. He became a creature of the night, taking a job stocking shelves at a supermarket. The building's massive air conditioning system a constant, soothing companion. His mental scars were invisible but profound. He was perpetually exhausted, living on a knife edge of anxiety. Any sudden sharp sound, a car horn, a plate dropping, even a laugh that was too loud, would send him spiraling, his hands clamping over his ears, his breath hitching, convinced it had found him. He was a ghost in his own life, haunting the aisles of canned goods at 3 a.m. He'd see the posters for the film they had finished. It was a minor critical success. He'd read an article where the director laughed about the technical gremlins that plagued the shoot. They had continued. They had wrapped, edited, and released. The rest of the recording had gone smoothly, just as the original story said. Ken often wondered what Bro Yim had promised those invisible shapes in the darkness. What had he pleaded for? What had he offered? Then, one night, stocking bags of rice, the answer hit him with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't taken Bro Yim. They hadn't taken the director or the star. They had taken him. The price for the quiet hum of cameras, and the sound of relief had been his own peace. He was the sacrifice. He was the one who had been listening too closely, the one who had opened the channel. The whispers hadn't been banished, they had simply found a new home. He finished his shift as the sun was coming up. He walked home, the sounds of the waking city a cacophony of small terrors. He fumbled for his keys, let himself into his dim apartment, and stood for a long moment, listening. The hum of the dryer next door, the buzz of his old refrigerator, and beneath it, a high-pitched whine. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness, the whispers swirled, familiar now, almost comforting in their sheer, unending malice. He had survived, but he would never be fine. He had barely made it out, and he'd left the most important part of himself behind in that haunted, silent room. The oppressive atmosphere on set 3 had finally lifted, evaporating as quickly as it had descended. The suffocating cold was gone, the phantom whispers had ceased, and the oppressive weight that had settled on their shoulders had vanished. It was as if a storm had broken, all because the old production manager, Bro Yim, had stood in the center of the set, hands on his hips, and bellowed a single furious phrase into the shadows. Later that night, as the crew packed away the heavy equipment, the air still humming with nervous energy, one of the younger assistants, Leo, wiped a sheen of cold sweat from his forehead. He looked over at Bro Yim, who was sipping calmly from a thermos of tea as if nothing had happened. "I don't get it," Leo murmured to Ah-Ming, a senior lighting technician who had been with the company for decades. "How could Bro Yim fix everything just by yelling? Did he scare it away? Can you even scare a ghost?" Ah-Ming gave a slow, faint smile, the lines around his eyes deepening. He screwed the cap back on his own flask, his gaze distant, fixed on the dark rigging high above the set. "You think that's all he did? You think he was yelling at the spirit?" Ah-Ming shook his head. "No, young man. He was yelling at us. He was reminding it that he was still here. You're new. You only know Bro Yim as the grumpy old manager. You don't know the legend behind his name." He gestured for Leo to sit on a nearby apple box. The other crew members, sensing a story, quietly drifted closer. "This happened about 10 years ago," Ah-Ming began, his voice dropping to a respectful hush. "Right here, on this very set, Studio 3, we were shooting a big-budget, ghost-themed period drama. Tensions were high, the schedule was brutal, and strange things had been happening for weeks. Cold spots, tools vanishing. The lead actress kept complaining that she could hear a woman humming an old tune, one nobody recognized." Ah-Ming paused, taking a deep breath. "We all ignored it. We blamed fatigue. Then, one night, we were filming the main climax, a complicated scene in a crumbling temple, and that's when it happened. Our best lighting technician, a good friend of mine named David, was up on the gantry, adjusting a heavy spotlight. Suddenly, he just collapsed. He didn't slip. He just went down like a puppet with its strings cut. He was dangling from his safety harness, completely unconscious. At the exact same second, every light on the set exploded, not just burned out, they exploded. Glass rained down on everyone. It was pure chaos. People were screaming, but the lead actress, she wasn't looking up at David. She was staring, pale as death, at the playback monitor behind the director's chair, and she screamed, "There's someone standing there! There's someone in white behind the camera!" We all turned. There was nothing on the monitor but static. But the feeling in the room, Leo, it was ice. It was a suffocating, hateful cold. The crew panicked. People ran for the doors. They refused to continue. The director, a tough guy from Hong Kong, was white as a sheet. The producers were threatening to sue. The entire multi-million-dollar production was dead in the water. Then Bro Yim, who was just a head of props back then, stepped forward. He looked calm. He just said, "Everyone out, now." He ushered every last person out of the studio. The actors, the The director, the terrified producers, everyone. Then he looked at the massive, groaning metal sound doors and said, "Close them, and don't open them until I knock." We stood outside in the corridor for what felt like an eternity. We could hear nothing at first. Then we heard him talking, not yelling, just talking, in a low, steady voice. We couldn't make out the words. It sounded like he was reasoning with someone, pleading, almost. Then it went silent again. 30 minutes passed. The producers were frantic, talking about calling an exorcist, calling the police. We were all terrified. We thought he was dead. Finally, the heavy door handle turned. Bro Yim pushed it open and stepped out. He looked exhausted, drained, but he was unharmed. He just looked at the director and said the one thing none of us expected: "We can start shooting now." Leo stared, wide-eyed. "But what did he do? What did he say?" Ah Ming shook his head. "No one ever asked, not even the director. We just knew it worked." We went back in. The cold was gone. The set felt peaceful. We got David down. He woke up an hour later in the hospital, remembering nothing but a sudden, intense feeling of sorrow. We finished the film without a single other incident. "But you want to know what he did?" Ah Ming leaned in closer. "I pieced it together later, from things Bro Yim let slip over the years. He didn't perform an exorcism. He didn't use holy water or paper charms. He just talked, because he knew her. You see, this studio was built on old ground, back in the 1960s. And in this very studio, a young actress named Lin Yao was promised the world. She was brilliant, beautiful, set to be the biggest star of her generation. She was supposed to star in a film called The Crimson Bride. Ironically, the very same story we were remaking 10 years ago. The director of that original film, he was a powerful man. He promised her the role, but he used her. He took advantage of her. And when she fell pregnant, he and the studio heads turned their backs on her. They blacklisted her, ruined her name, gave the role to another actress. Broken, humiliated, and with nowhere to go, Lin Yao came back here, to Studio 3. She was still wearing the white cheongsam from her final, failed screen test. She climbed up into the darkness of the lighting gantry, right where David collapsed, and she took her own life. She never left. She became the woman in white everyone whispered about. She wasn't evil. She was just broken, filled with a grief so profound it stained the very walls of this place. She hated the camera, because it represented the director who betrayed her. She hated the lights, because they were the last thing she saw. Leo felt a cold dread, but this time it was mixed with understanding. All the stories he'd dismissed as crew superstition suddenly clicked into place. "So all those times," Leo whispered, "all those times the lights flickered, or the cameras inexplicably lost focus." "It was her," Ah Ming affirmed, "her lashing out, her reminding everyone of her pain." "And Bro Yim?" Bro Yim was a teenage runner on that original 1960s film. He was just a kid, but he was the only one who was ever kind to Lin Yao. He'd fetch her tea, listen to her talk about her dreams. He was probably the last person who spoke to her with any kindness. "When he went into that room 10 years ago," Ah Ming said, his voice thick with emotion, "he went in as her friend. He didn't banish her. He comforted her. He apologized. He apologized on behalf of the whole industry for what they did to her. He made her a promise. He promised that as long as he worked in this studio, he would ensure everyone showed respect, not just to the set, but to her memory. He told her that the new crew, our crew, meant her no harm, that we were just trying to tell a story, just as she once wanted to, and in return, she would let us work in peace." Leo finally understood. He looked back at Bro Yim, who was now packing his bag. Just another old man at the end of a long day. So tonight, Leo said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. When he yelled, he wasn't yelling at her. No, Ah-Ming said, standing up. He was yelling at you, at all the new kids who were laughing and messing around on her set. Forgetting the rules, he was keeping his promise. He was telling her, I'm still here, Lin Yao. I'm still watching. They are just kids. Please, be at peace. That's the legend of Bro Yim, Ah-Ming concluded, clapping Leo on the shoulder. He's not an exorcist. He's a guardian. He's the keeper of a promise made to a ghost decades ago. So, what do you think? Is Bro Yim just a skilled technician who understands old equipment? Or is he truly a ghost king walking between our world and the spirit realm? This story touches on a deep-seated cultural belief, especially in places like Hong Kong, that the spirit world isn't separate from ours. It coexists with us, often just out of sight. The flickering lights and glitching equipment aren't just technical errors. They're seen as signs of them passing through or making their presence known. Bro Yim represents the traditional master or adept, someone who understands the rules of both sides. He doesn't use force. He uses respect and ancient knowledge, reminding the spirits that the space and the stories must be shared. It's a balance, not a battle. What other local legends have you heard where the two worlds collide? Share your own stories in the comments below. If you enjoy tales from the unseen side, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the dark legends we're exploring next.